I have issues with the way Occupy went about what it did.
Interesting.
And based on what you're saying, what appears is in this book, and what I've been saying for years and years, and when I've taught the social movements of the 60s, I point out 3 separate steps, 2 of which were never done by Occupy. And so I'm curious to see, where this falls in. So I think we'll get interesting theoretical discussion somewhere down the hour here. But I do want to address that. So I want to make sure I have the name.
He never went to New York, which was where the main protests were, and it was truly a leaderless movement. So it was a horizontal movement where they had no leaders, and I thought that was a very interesting.
It really was. Now, what has Occupy achieved?
Well,
I mean, honestly, because there's been no legislation, there's been no litigation. There was a nice protest, and a protest that did nothing, because when people went to the Occupy sites and said, "What are you proposing?" the answer was, "Oh, we're not proposing anything, we're just pointing out the problem." And that is the purpose of protest, is to point out the problem. But if you don't do the rest of the steps, there's no change ever going to happen.
I absolutely agree with you, but I believe, in my own opinion,
which is
the Occupy movement sparked a culture of activism in America.
It may have.
And so even though that protest did not go anywhere, and he is going to be the first one to admit, I actually was able to interview him when he was releasing his book, and he would be the first to admit that Occupy was a failure.
Mm-hmm.
But he quotes somewhere in his book, he says that in hopes the Occupy movement shattered into 1,000 pieces of light, right? So it was just this spark that kind of just exploded into the culture, and now we're seeing these little bits and fragments of it. And today we're going to be talking about Occupy, Black Lives Matter, and Standing Rock, and I think each of these movements have a unique voice. So Occupy was really talking about the systematic corporate issues of America, right? And that grew into the Black Lives Matter movement that started addressing these social and human issues, also talking about the systematic, right? So they're talking about the prison industrial complex, the schools and how they're broken, the education system. There's one other main thing. Oh, and the police, right? So it still was taking that structural, targeting those structural issues, but it was on a human element. And then with Standing Rock and NODAPL protest, they were focusing the environmental. So, as for Occupy, what was it able to change? What was it able to do? It potentially inspired activism into the hearts and into the culture of America, and it still continues to this day. That's my opinion on it.
And I don't discount that. I think that it did kind of reintroduce the whole notion of let's civil disobedience. Where I think it completely failed, and again, I think it did a lot. I do agree with you. It did a lot of good, but where it completely failed was once it addressed the issues. It said, "Well, we don't have any. There's no solutions. We don't even propose any solutions, right?" And that's where it lost a lot of credibility with a lot of people, because there were people listening. There were people going, there is inequality, and that at least the notion that there is inequality, and that's one of the problems, is what's there. But would Professor Reich have made his movie Inequality for All, which addresses all of those same issues, had not Occupy been there, or would he have done that anyway? And it would, I think the two fed off of each other. I think people went and watched the movie because they were interested in the topic that BLM had put out there. Mm-hmm. But where did we end up? We ended up with a tax cut that enlarged the problem.
Right.
We've ended up in the opposite place of where we were supposed to. But
and if you look at Black Lives Matter, I feel like the activist community learned from that failure. And in the Black Lives Matter movement, they were very specific with their statement of demands. If you look at Campaign Zero, they have their 10 statements. It's simple. They're images. There's graphics. You can literally look at the image of handcuffs and understand that they're talking about something that has to do with law enforcement within a matter of seconds. That's a great campaign model, so they understood.
So
we need to be clear.
What specific legislation and litigation has come out of either of those?
So I would say with the Black Lives Matter movement, police departments have absolutely been held accountable to a different degree than beforehand. So the body cameras, having community forums, community insight, there's a word for it, but just the panels where they're able to really see and discuss things.
Outreach and those types of things.
Yeah, so if you look at their statement of demands in Campaign Zero, you can see what has grown from that. And when I was on here last time with Aaron Foster, who was with Faith and Community, that they were working on a 6-month program with the police department to build community relationships.
That's right.
That came from Black Lives Matter, in my opinion. That was a successful, and that was throughout the state of California, for what we know, from what I'm familiar with.
Right.
I'm not familiar with as much of the national impact, but, in regards to California and policies in different communities, I believe Black Lives Matter is probably the most successful in regards to changing policy and really getting to the bottom of things. And it's still continuing to this day, So look at Sacramento and what's happening. They just arrested 90 protesters on a bridge, right? Like last weekend or something like that.
Yep.
So, these topics are really important to talk about, to analyze. And then also, in regards to what we're going to be talking about tonight, learning about different infiltration techniques and learning ways to combat that so we can actually have success in these movements.
There's been a history, even here in Fresno, of various law enforcement at various levels getting involved in things like Peace Fresno. I know there was a big to-do back in the 70s, I believe it was, during the anti-war protests that Fresno PD infiltrated Peace Fresno, and they were monitoring them and writing reports and all kinds of stuff. And so we know that it's happened here in town with various groups. I see no reason why it doesn't continue. It's probably continuing today. What are some of the infiltration techniques that we're talking about? What are some of the things that in looking at these prior protest movements and other things, what are some of the things that you've come across?
Well, if we want to talk about infiltration, and a great book that really highlights this, it's called The War at Home. I love this book. It's easy to read. It's, The War at Home, Covert Action Against U.S. Activists and What We Can Do About It. It was written by a lawyer named Brian Glick, where he really breaks down the history of these covert actions. And his theory and what he breaks down is that infiltration and covert actions have been happening since the founding of this country, specifically in regards to the Native American population and the Black community. So these tactics aren't just utilized in the 70s, or now. This is deeply historically rooted inside of this country, and the policies of unknown fact that many people may not know is that there are over 1 million employees in regards to the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, ICE, which is larger than our actual military. So, we can tell that there is funding, that there, are structures and systems that support these type of actions. The book, The War at Home, it goes into the history of the 1960s and the 1970s in the civil rights movement, and it highlights all the different groups that were targeted. So the Native American movement, and we can see this still historically and still until this day. The Black movement, where the COINTELPRO actually
yeah.
triggered the collapse of the Black Panthers in the winter of 1971. The Chicano.
Well, you kill enough of them, and it tends to do that. So.
Right, and you arrest and frame and, push drugs into the community, break up the community. The thing is, the Native Americans and the Black communities have never been able to gain power, right? So every time that they start to organize, they start to, come up with these great, incredible ideas. Like the Black Panthers started the breakfast movement. They started, in schools.
They had health clinics. They had reading rooms. They did all kinds of community outreach in many different ways, and they had a few guns, and that was why California had such strong gun control for so many years. Was because Ronald Reagan, good old Republican Ronald Reagan, Second Amendment Ronald Reagan, who said the Second Amendment doesn't give anybody the right to have guns. That's not what it's about. He's on, or not guns, but machine guns and assault rifles. He said nobody had the right to have that. But he pushed and pushed until California passed strict gun laws because of the Panthers. That was why all of a sudden California had to be gun-free.
Absolutely. Yeah, and so, we can tell historically and currently that these techniques and tactics and covert actions do exist. And, I think that it is so important as activists, as revolutionaries, to look at, how these infiltrators go about this so that we can be prepared to combat these techniques so we can actually have some sort of success.
Well, let's take a real quick break, and when we come back, we will discuss some of those techniques. You're listening to The Struggle. I'm Dr. Michael Eisinger. Tonight we're with Kayla Moon, award-winning journalist. That is in my notes here. We'll talk about that when we come back. You're listening to The Struggle on 88.1 KFCF.
This week on The Pioneers, Revolution from the Heart of Nature.
I call this century the Sophia century, when women will take our rightful role in co-equal partnership with men and the world will come into balance.
I'm Neil Harvey. It's Lynn Twist, Layla Salazar, and Oriel Osprey Lake in the Sophia century, this week on The Pioneers.
The Pioneers, Thursdays at 3:30 on 88.1 FM, KFCF Fresno, Free Speech Radio.
Hi, I'm Jim Compton-Schmidt. Tune in every Monday at 11 a.m. for a program featuring great jazz artists from all around the world. I call the program Jazz, America's World Music. We're here on KFCF 88.1 FM, Fresno, California.
And we're back with The Struggle on 88.1 KFCF. Kayla Moon is with me tonight, and before we ended the break, I announced her as an award-winning journalist, and you were grinning and sniggering and laughing and doing all the stuff that you do. You want to clarify that, or you want to explain what it is?
Yeah,
congratulations on your award.
Thank you. Yeah, it was very much a surprise. I had taken a little bit of a break from journalism because it's exhausting work, and most of it I don't get paid for. So
tends to want to take a break.
I'm like, oh, hold on.
Wait a minute. How much do I make on this show?
Right, exactly.
Dennis, do you remember how? Never mind. Nick's not here today. He's at home doing some work, but Dennis is in the booth, and
Michael is one of our volunteer programmers that we love so much.
Yes. So most of the work that we do in in this field is volunteer. And so, I had to take a little bit of a step back, and I got an email from Mike Rhodes from Community Alliance, and he said, you're getting an award for your journalism. And I was like, really? What article? And it was the first article I ever published.
Oh, good.
And, it was talking about the Fresno PD, or PD and how it's corrupt.
Right.
And
Yeah, I saw that article earlier today. I was trying to find the one we're talking about.
Right.
It wasn't.
Yeah.
I did come across that one.
Yeah. So it was an award for best article.
Oh, cool. A little plaque or a
Yeah, it was a
statue
cool
or
little
something.
plaque, and it has
Did
my
you get up
name
and thank
on
your
it.
parents and thank your husband for supporting you all these years?
It was at their fundraiser last year, and they did let me go up and speak for a little bit, and I just, was thankful and grateful that, Mike Rhodes has supported my journey in journalism since day one, and I really appreciate those people that, are believed in me even when I'm like, am I doing this right? Like,
we all need people like that in our lives, and I think we
Yeah.
all can point to 2 or 3 people who at some point in our life said, you know what, you're doing okay.
Right? I know.
You're doing okay. You may not be great, but you're doing okay, right? You give us a little bit of encouragement.
Yes.
So before the
yes.
break, we were talking a little bit about activism and a little bit about infiltration, and we talked a little bit about the past. You want to talk specifics about things that are going on with Occupy, with BLM, with Standing Rock, primarily those 3. So, 1, 2, 3, go.
Yeah, let's get into it.
I hadn't really phrased that in a way that it was going to be a question. I'm like, how am I going to work these words around?
You're like, just go for
Yeah,
it.
we talked about it during the break. You know what I want you to talk about.
Yes. So the reason why I'm highlighting these 3 movements specifically is I feel like there's a lot to learn from the different, forms of success that have come out of them, but also some of their failures. And specifically looking at the techniques that have been utilized to stop these movements. So with Occupy Wall Street, in this article that I'm working on, and it's going to be published through Community Alliance, with Occupy Wall Street, broadcasting and televised infiltration was a really big one that I found on the grounds of infiltration and also counter tactics. So these were some of the covert actions that were taken up against the movement.
So describe some of them. I'm not clear.
Yeah, so in regards to broadcasting and televised infiltration, there were blackouts, media blackouts. So you can kind of see there's no coverage. I believe this is before live streaming existed. So there was really no way to get an independent narrative up and running, right? So the media didn't cover it. And then all of a sudden, once the police started coming in and arresting people, now there's this amplified, so that's kind of one thing, a media technique that's used. So it's either a complete blackout, so there's silence, dead air on it, and then, or it's completely amplified, especially when, there's police force and militarized tactics happening. So I think that
now, on my TV, for the majority of the time that BLM was in Zuccotti Park.
Occupy, yeah.
Yeah, I meant Occupy.
Yeah.
It was in Zuccotti Park. I saw coverage daily, but that wasn't on all networks or all channels.
And it was ignored for the first 2 weeks or so. So that blackout period, and then once it started becoming more of a big deal, and the thing is we have social media.
How is that a police tactic?
Well, it's a corporate media tactic.
Right, but we were talking law enforcement.
Well, there's different forms of infiltration. There's law enforcement tactics. There's corporate media techniques. There are state, and then as well as corporate and private interests. So we have to look at all of these different
Players.
Yes, players in the game. It's not just coming from one source. And so it's really important to look at, so for example, in the counter tactics, New York was going to these protesters and saying, you need a protest permit. You're, encouraging organizers to work with authorities, right? To let them know if they were going to have a protest or, a gathering, to have them be in free speech zones where you couldn't hear anything the people were saying, right?
And that's a technique that was developed basically after the convention in '68, when they when the permitting became so important. It had been used before. It had been used by the city of Oakland to keep Berkeley protesters out during the anti-war protests, but it really became a big deal after '68. This whole permitting process, which we see here in town, all of the marches that I'm involved with, is like, you can't, don't walk against the light, you can't step in the street, it's like, and many of these movements, many of these permitting attempts at things like conventions or like at the BLM, they are put off in places where you can't see them, you can't get to. If you want to protest at the National Convention for either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party in 2 years, you will have to get a permit. You will get a 10 by 10 square 3 miles at least away from the venue where the event is happening, and you can stand there and protest all you want, and if the media happens to come by and take some stills, you might get the back page of the newspaper someplace. And that has been a technique that's been used against protests for 40 years, 50 years.
Absolutely. So those are kind of the counter tactics that were utilized in Occupy Wall Street, and it's important to mention, so for activists, if you're interested in, following the X, Y, and Z, apply for the permits, right? But if you want revolutionary actions, is that the best way to go about it?
I think each protest has its merits one way or the other, and I think it would be dependent on A, the protesters, and B, where that protest is, and C, what it's about.
Absolutely.
So I think it's a call that most activists have to make.
Absolutely, and that's why it's the theory, right? And it's important to kind of talk about these concepts and introduce, maybe different ideas, potentials, and at the end of the day, it is up to the individual or the organization to, follow through with it. So, and then there was actual on-the-ground infiltration that happened at Occupy, where a journalist from the New York Daily News reported aggressive vagrants were being sent to Occupy by New York police in a strategy to exploit the movement and the open structure that was happening. So, they would go to different parks and see people that were very aggressive or intoxicated and say, go to Zuccotti. Go to Zuccotti Park, and so once again, the theory and, looking at these different techniques, it's interesting. How do we combat that, right? It's a conversation starter because it did disrupt.
Or how do you co-opt it? Here in Fresno, when they set up the Occupy encampment downtown, it was the homeless who basically did the occupying for a big period of that time because they were already there. They were willing to do it, and that led a lot of well-meaning liberals like myself to go home and sleep in our own beds and be comfortable.
Right.
But at least here, by bringing them in rather than allowing them to be used as a distraction, I think was a smart move on the part of the organizers here.
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's lots of things to learn from Occupy. My final point, is that this movement did engage over 113 U.S. cities, with a total of 7,000 arrests to occur. And, it was only allotted these 30-second sound bites and narrations from people that were not of their own movement, but through spectators and, the people that, talk.
Well, and there's a catch-22 there. When you say you're a leaderless movement, then who do you interview? And that there was an issue there. There were people like, well, we don't have any leaders. Well, who do you interview? Then who do you talk to? Who is your spokesperson? How do I know that you're saying what the group wants, right? And so there's also a problem there for journalists when they're doing the interviews, going, you could be somebody the police sent in here to be an idiot, or you could be a spokesman. And so some of the interesting features of Occupy turned out to be bugs, in my opinion, in that it was hard to find who do you talk to. It was hard to nail down some of the stuff, because if everyone was a spokesman, there were a lot of different things being said.
Absolutely. Yeah. So a lot of things to learn from that. The next movement that I think is, important to highlight is the Black Lives Matter movement. And there's many different infiltration techniques utilized through this movement, some that even happened here locally in Fresno. So there's a lot of online infiltration. So, in the book, The War at Home, it states, these techniques are always going to evolve, right? So back in the civil rights movement, there wasn't the internet. That didn't even exist in people's minds, right? So in regards to looking at some of these techniques now, we can find trolling to be very common, hacking, online surveillance, smear campaigns, fake websites, profiling, right? Profiling and banning of different accounts, right? People have been banned off of YouTube and Patreon, Twitter, the majority of social media accounts are, platforms. Yeah. And so in regards to actual on-the-grounds infiltration, the Fresno PD was actually working with a private tech company. So that's where these different elements kind of come in, and these different factors. So this private tech company was helping Fresno PD spy on local Black Lives Matter activists. And I actually interviewed Jerry Dyer, the police chief, in regards to this program. And, it was actually found out by accident. These local community organizers were touring through the police department, and they're like, wait a minute, what's that? And they're like, oh, this is our software program, and we're collecting all this data. And, they're all excited about it. These activists are like, what? So the ACLU got involved, and there's a quote, I love this quote from the ACLU. It was an article on their website, and it says, while the way in which our society expresses itself is shifting, the principles of the First Amendment remain unchanged. Advances in technology are not an excuse for new forms of unaccountable surveillance. So that was Matt Cagle, and it was just the program. It was just wild. They were actually labeling. So people that, would post something and then put like hashtag Black Lives Matter, they were being labeled as threats to public safety. And so in regards to, what's happening in Sacramento right now, I was watching a lot of the footage on city council, or where the activists were speaking at city council. And it was really interesting because, whoever was kind of keeping track of their time limits and getting people to introduce themselves, she wouldn't allow them to move forward unless they stated their name. And I really thought that was a technique in profiling, because, these activists, they would start to talk and they're like, no, what's your name? What's your name? And the activists would give their name, and then they'd keep it moving. It's like, okay, so we know historically Black Lives Matter activists have been labeled as domestic terrorists and threats to public safety. Why are you giving your names to these people? That's what I'm thinking in my mind. Like, oh my God, come on now. But Alicia Garza, she's one of the co-founders of the National Black Lives Matter movement. And she stated that it's imperative for people to take these tactics seriously. She talks about how it's very important to learn how to identify state intervention. And she's speaking from experience, because her group has been labeled a domestic terrorist group. Members have experienced home visits from the FBI. Some have actually been banned from traveling outside of the U.S., and she even talks about how it's really important to look at the psychological effects, and that these techniques can be incredibly traumatizing to the victims that have to experience this. So,
Standing Rock.
Yeah, this one, I mean, when I was watching the live footage,
Was there
Did
actual
you see it?
infiltration, or was this just bowling over? Because to me, it just seemed like it was just law enforcement just rolling right over with bigger machines and bigger guns than the natives had.
Well,
I mean, there may be. That's what I'm asking.
yeah,
If there was
there
infiltration
actually
as well.
was on the ground infiltration. So a journalist by the name of Derek Brose, he's an independent journalist. He's founded the Conscious Resistance, and I actually am a member, and I've spoke with him in person multiple times, and he's done incredibly well in his independent journalism journey. So he was there, and he actually captured live footage of unknown individuals going up to these militarized vehicles that were just left on a bridge, and conveniently, and these unknown individuals started setting fire
I remember this.
to these vehicles.
Yeah, I remember this.
And his footage, it's like so historic because you can actually hear an elder walking up to these individuals and saying, "Stop, please, like this is not in alignment with what our movement's representing. We're here to be prayerful, we're peaceful, this is not in alignment," and so this elder is going and trying to intervene, and it was essentially too late. These vehicles caught flame. I don't know if they lit them with gasoline or what, but after that, that's when the militarized occupation really occurred, and it was a domestic war zone, in my opinion.
No, it was an absolute mess. It was a disaster.
Against people who were unarmed, women, children, and if we want to look at,
You'd think they'd been at the southern border.
yeah, if we want to look at the severity of how far the American government is willing to take it, we have to look at the Native American movements and the Black movements and see what these militarized occupations look like. So there were water cannons utilized. Water cannons actually have the ability to rip flesh from the bone.
Sure. But how are you calling that an infiltration? I mean, I understand the guys pretending to be members of the organization and lighting fires, but the cannon is just a weapon against.
Right, and at that point, that's just covert action.
Right.
That's just
That's pretty overt when you're shooting a cannon at somebody.
Right, overt action, and I think that the on the grounds infiltration opened the door for that to happen, and so we kind of have to put those pieces together. Right, they maybe wouldn't have had an excuse if they didn't have those people on the grounds causing this disruption.
That's a common technique that's been used since, I don't know how long. It's probably been used for thousands of years. Of there's a protest or there's a group you wish to attack. So you have to get something going so that you have the justification for it. So you send someone in, it gets violent. This happened in Oakland during the Black Lives Matter protests, when all of a sudden people would show up with masks and all that stuff and start breaking stuff. The BLM people said they're not with us. The police said, well, they're marching with you, as well, but they're not our people, and it still allowed the Oakland police, who have a long history of messing with people, which is why the Panthers existed in the first place.
Right.
And they were using stooges and infiltrators at that particular point. So it does. I mean, we have examples of that.
Yeah, interesting little side point on that. I was actually in the hospital giving birth to my first child while the protests were going on in Oakland, and you could actually hear the riots outside of the hospital. Yes, that's where my child was born. Berkeley community, but you could literally hear these riots. I'm laying in this hospital bed holding my newborn, and I'm just hearing these riots outside. It's like, welcome to the world, child. I don't know what to say.
There you go.
Like,
welcome. Is she out there protesting now, or?
She does protest, but it's over, when she wants lollipops or candy after bedtime.
We all have our priorities.
She's 4, so.
Speaking of our priorities, I need to take a quick break, and we will be back with The Struggle on 88.1 KFCF.
On the third Wednesday of every month from 3 to 3:30, Speak Truth to Empire. I'm your host, Dan Yassin. We talk about U.S. policies, both foreign and domestic, and examine the actions of the U.S. government, big corporations, and the mainstream media. Each month, I interview authors, scholars, bloggers, and activists, guests who help us examine American imperialism. On the third Wednesday of every month from 3 to 3:30 on 88.1 KFCF Free Speech Radio for Central California.
Years ago, a psychologist had some bizarre ideas for settling child custody battles.
An option, and I'm very serious about this, is to take the kid and put him in jail.
And his theories are still turning kids' lives upside down.
I kind of lost out on my childhood. I lost out on my father. I lost out on my brother being there. And they did that to me.
Bitter Custody on the next Reveal.
Thursdays at 4 on KFCF Fresno.
And we're back on the struggle with Kayla Moon, award-winning journalist. And today we're talking about techniques used by law enforcement to infiltrate resistance organizations and potential solutions. And during the break, we talked about that we'd like to touch on some of the solutions. And I'm going to put this out. I'm not sure we're actually going to get that far, but we may take some phone calls depending on how time goes. I don't know if we'll have time, but we may be able to get in one or two calls at the end of the show.
Perfect, yeah.
So we'll just see how it goes, but okay. I'm not sure if we have the time, but we'll try.
We'll try. I think it'd be interesting to hear some feedback and, some insight.
I would too. I'm curious to see what people have to think. So let's talk about some of the solutions. How do we, as members of Peace Fresno, as the members of the local Women's March, or the Kids Against Guns, or local BLM, or local Voto Latino, all the different groups that we interview here on the show and that we talk about, how do they deal with the issue of infiltration by primarily of the law enforcement at this point in the operation of their group? What do they do to protect themselves?
Right. So, I think not being afraid of talking about this, a lot of times it's just kind of a topic that people don't really want to go there. And I can understand the uncomfortability as to why, but, if we have these conversations, if we can somehow prepare ourselves mentally, emotionally, and keep an eye out, why not? Crisis prevention, right? And, the reason why so many of these movements have not found the success that they seek is due to these tactics. And I want to be clear, it's not only from local police departments. It can be from corporations. It can be from, the state. It comes from a multitude. Tulare County, was just infiltrated by an Israeli Psy group, and it was over a hospital.
The hospital that they had to shut down that they're reopening.
Exactly, yeah, and they were trying to hire some, good community members to have some oversight, and there was all these smear campaigns going up. The woman that was running for the position, this unknown person came up to her and handed her an envelope, and she's like, what is this? And all the while there's a person hiding in bushes taking pictures, this is bribe money, while the person's telling her, oh, it's a gift card from a fan, we appreciate what you're doing. And it was literally a $35 gift card to Walmart, but the whole time they're taking these pictures of this bush, and so it's just, being aware, being prepared. I'd say the first step is acknowledging that these techniques have always existed in this country, and being honest and being upfront about it. Knowing that if it is a movement in regards to, Black Lives Matter or Native Americans or just in general Black and brown people, they have to be prepared more than other groups. I think that, not being aware is just, the success of your movement depends on it. It depends on being prepared for these potential techniques of infiltration and covert action. Really, the success of your movement depends on it. You know, and this is just my opinion, but to see city, state, and national figures as potential enemies of the people. And I know that sounds a little out there to say, but if you're being labeled as a threat to public safety, do these leaders, you know, are they your allies? Are they on your side? You know, let's be aware. Let's talk about it. You know, the city council of Sacramento right now is just completely complicit in regards to all these different activists, you know, who are truly talking about genuine systematic issues. So, you know, and in regards to different organizations, maybe some type of screening process in the activists that they're able to bring on, you know. Did you have something you wanted to say?
No, I'm good.
You know, some type of background check, right? When someone joins the military, they have the FBI talk to your neighbor, your friend, your father. Why don't we do something a little similar just to see who's joining the ranks?
I don't know that the FBI will run the same background checks that...
I mean, we could take from some of those techniques.
Right.
The government does certain things to protect itself.
Mm-hmm.
Why are these organizations, why are these activist groups not doing similar things, right? If it's up to the success of your movement to be engaged on this level. In my opinion, this is my opinion.
I mean, I think as far as like background checks and things like that, you get a lot of resistance from a lot of people who would say, well, that's the reason I'm protesting. I don't want my background checked. And what do you mean you want to know everything I ever did and who I ever slept with and
I want
what
to talk to your
thought?
neighbor. What kind of person is it? Like, who are you? What are you about? You know, I mean, hey, if you smoked a little weed in your past, whatever, you know, but if you're, you know, I think it's good to be aware, right? And just get creative with it. These are just my own, you know, thoughts and ideas on it. But, you know, for different organizations and groups to get creative, to think about it, to educate its community and its population about this. You know, and that's essentially what I got, you know, just get creative, you know, be aware, educate yourself, you know.
I'd really be curious to see how that checkup on him is going to actually implement, because like I said, I mean, many of the people that are involved in these movements now, many people who are getting involved in a lot of the movements today are pretty mainstream, pretty middle of the road, housewives and business people and that type of thing. But again, you don't know that until you've had a chance to check out who they are a little bit.
Absolutely. And my final point is, because we know that these techniques and these forms of covert action do exist, to start speaking out about it and try to get some systematic change. The War at Home highlights and suggests that we expose domestic covert action as undemocratic and actually a form of terrorism, right? They're labeling us as a terrorist. They're labeling us, activists and community organizers, as terrorists. No. The techniques that they're using, that is the true form of terrorism. So really, you know, getting some type of policy, you know, at the end of the day, the CIA and the FBI got free range after the civil rights movement. So maybe going in and saying, you know, we want to, you know, do
the CIA
something
by
about
law
this.
shouldn't be doing anything with any local protests. By law, they really shouldn't. Their purview is outside of the country. We do have about 13 minutes. Should we maybe try to take a call? Somebody has some thoughts on infiltration of various and sundry resistance organizations, ways that we can prevent it, things we should look out for. Is 266-8888. That's 266-8888. Dennis is standing by. It always seems that Dennis is standing by when I'm putting out the phone number, whether it's a pledge break or we open up the lines for the talk show. Dennis is my phone guy, I guess.
Thank you, Dennis.
266, yeah, thank you, Dennis. 266-8888. Give me a call. Kayla's here. She's dying to talk to you. I'm here. You can say hello. 266-8888. And while we're waiting for that call, one of the things, and one of the reasons, I feel like I was really negative talking about Michael White when we were first talking about the Occupy movement and some of the shortcomings there, and one of the main reason is that several times I've taught a class on social movements of the '60s, and those groups that are that historically have been the most successful are those that don't just protest. Protest by itself does nothing but waste everybody's time. You have
I absolutely agree.
You have to have it, because the primary purpose of protest is essentially to get beat up so you end up on the TV. That's really the purpose of protest, is to get the problem out there. And this is where Occupy was brilliant. Occupy did a great job. They did get the word out there. However, the groups that were most successful, and I put the civil rights movement in that as the premier in that group, starting in the 40s, going up through the mid-60s and into the early 70s, was they added two prongs to that approach. The first one was to litigate. Every single law that is oppressive, you take it to court. I mean, that's why we have Brown v. Board of Education. That's why we have the Rosa Parks decision. That's why we have these changes, because people challenged the bad law.
Right.
And then the third step is, that's when you finally get around to talking to the politicians. Up to that point, you stay away from politics, because politics will screw your movement like crazy.
Right.
So you stay away from the politicians. They want to come and be an ally, that's fine, but they're ally. They're not at the center. When you get to, once you've done the protest and people are aware of the problem, you've done the litigation and you've gotten rid of some of the bad laws, then you legislate and pass good law, right? Or you attempt to. So the Civil Rights Act and all of that stuff comes out of that. And that is the good side of these protest movements, is what actually gets something done. And that was the problem I had with Occupy, was they didn't even, it was like, well, what do you suggest? Oh, we don't have any suggestions. I mean, they literally would throw their hands up in the air and on the camera and go, oh, we don't have any suggestions. We're just trying to point out the problem. Dennis, have we got some, it looks like something's flashing over there. Or maybe it isn't. No, Dennis isn't there. There's, oh, Richard in Fresno, welcome to the struggle.
Hey, how are you guys?
You know, I think we're doing all right. How about yourself?
Well, it's interesting because the topic you're talking about, it's because it's really weird. I mean, because the FBI, the CIA, the federal government, and everyone, they really have no morals about this. One of the amazing things about it, for example, like Dennis Banks, leader of AIM a few years ago, in his last book, he literally on the last few pages, found out that his wife of many years and their kids, his wife was an FBI informant.
It's terrible.
On him. Not just, but that's not the only one. There was a Cuban. The United States had an informant who married a woman from Cuba to find out about Cuban infiltration.
Right.
They had a few kids too, and then all of a sudden he disappears. And then they find out he's an informant. I mean, it seems like half the retinue of Martin Luther King supporters were infiltrators, as well as the Panthers and others. I mean, they know what they're doing to infiltrate people. It's incredible. But the idea of having someone marry someone to get information, and not just for a few days or a few months, but for some years, and have kids, that just blows my mind when I talk about it, and people think, no, that can't be.
That's a spy's mentality. Look at Maria Butina, right?
Yeah.
I mean, she didn't marry the guy who was already married, but she'd been, basically his mistress now for a number of years. He probably, if he had left his wife and her mission wasn't over, she probably would have married him. I mean, that seems to be not that rare an experience. Dennis, have we got multiple lines?
About being married, not a mistress, but married to her and having kids and everything and being together. And then all of a sudden, she shows up as an informant.
I'm going to talk to my wife when I get home.
There you go.
Hey, Richard, thank you so much. We have Valley on the line too. Valley, how are you doing tonight?
Very well, thanks, and good evening to you. you know, the problems are so bad and so immense that I really, one is confused to which one to pick and talk about.
All right.
But I think the best way to attack these problems is to be systematic and use the very system that is working against the people to work for the people. For example, aiding and abetting is against the law when committing a crime. And these infiltrators who infiltrate and then set cars on fire or tell kids to blow a place up, these should be punished for the very same crime that they are promoting the protesters to commit.
Absolutely.
That's a good point, Valley.
And I believe education is the key. The racists are our kids. The police who abuses the power, or the president who lies. Who are these people? They are not imported from Belgium. They are our kids.
Right.
We should educate people how to be better parents, how to raise kids, and empower kids in a school about these issues. So when they grow up and when they are a teacher or a police or a judge, whoever, they are familiar with these problems and they prevent them.
We need more Edward Snowdens, because wasn't he a part of the he was a whistleblower.
He was a whistleblower, and that case was handled so bizarrely and so badly by all concerned.
First of all, he is my hero. And second, we should build apparatuses in the system who prevents this type of activity.
I agree.
I agree.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ali. It was nice to talk to you today.
Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much.
Too. Thank you, my friend.
Thanks.
Next is Dave in Fresno. Dave, how are you doing?
I'm doing well.
All right, glad to hear it. What Kayla's here, say hello.
Well, I just wanted to say your comment about Occupy not making a statement or making a point, that if you remember at that time, different protest groups would make statements about what they put forward, and the mainstream media would just say, oh, no, that's stupid, that'll never work, and they just cut off the debate.
Well, no, Occupy at the time, they said we were only here to point out the problem. They said we don't offer any solutions. Other people were at the time, but Occupy itself, by its design, was set up to not offer solutions.
I would actually disagree with that. The founder, because we're studying it in the activist graduate school that I'm in right now, and when they first started sending out emails, they had the flyer, and I don't know if you remember, but it was the bowl with the ballerina on top of it, right? And the one statement at the bottom was, what is our one demand? Right. So the founders knew that it was a necessity to have that demand, but, they wanted it to be leaderless. They wanted it to be a leaderless movement. They never even stepped foot in New York while it was happening. And so, it took a life of its own, and the founder does talk about that. And,
are you part of Occupy, Dave?
Mm-hmm. Well, not officially.
Yeah, same here. I mean, I went to some of the protests and stuff, but I'm not a member. I'm not a joiner in many things.
Right.
So
We're theorists over here. We theorize.
Were you at some of the protests here in town? Because I found them fascinating.
Actually, I was living in the Bay Area when that was happening.
Oh, okay. Kayla and I were talking about it during one of the breaks. I think that Occupy did an amazing job of what they did. I wish that there had been more, because you really can't dialogue if you don't come up with solutions, right, wrong, or indifferent solutions. What was your biggest takeaway from what was going on when you were up at the protest, Dave?
Well, I just, it was good. The one thing they did was they shut up the Tea Party, because they pointed out, because the mainstream media was saying the Tea Party was the will of the people. Every stupid thing they said, 5 or 6 people at some protest was the will of the people.
Right.
And Occupy came out and said, oh, wait a minute, we're part of the people, and we don't agree with any of that stuff. You know, the 1% are just running all over us and taking everything away.
I do agree that what they did in getting the message out was, I think, highly commendable. I mean, the fact that we have phrases in our common everyday use today like, I'm one of the 99 percenters, or I'm one of the 99.9 percenters, or I'm, you know, a 1% or a 0.1%. Though having those labels, I think, and having the vocabulary with which to express some of these thoughts, I think BLM did a Occupy did a very commendable job with that.
I think Occupy gave people the strength and the bravery to dream and to actually get out there.
All right. Dave, I want to say goodnight.
Thank you,
Thank
Dave.
you for calling. I really appreciate it. Oh, I guess Dave is gone. Well, Kayla, I'm going to say the same thing to you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
We will be back again next week with The Struggle. I appreciate you guys putting up with us for the last hour. Kevin, Dennis, thank you very much. We'll talk to you next time.